I believed for a lot of reasons Brazil was a market that was primed and ready for solar. I just decided that's what I was going to try and go do. I went down to Brazil, ended up befriending founding executive of the largest iron ore mining company down there, who also happened to be on the board of the Ministry of Energy and Mining, and helped them put together a bidding system to kickstart the solar market in Brazil. Didn't go great.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Demo Day, the podcast for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, where we demystify the culture of joining one of the top accelerator, incubator, or VC funds from around the world. I'm your host, Sean Goldfaden from Coefficient Labs, and on today's episode, we'll be interviewing Jeff Crusey from Blacklake Group. Without further ado, let's get into Demo Day. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today on Demo Day.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Now, for those at home, Jeff is at Blacklake, and we're excited to learn more about the company, the space that you're in. For years and years, Demo Day has featured so many VCs, investors, private equity type teams, but really like the deep tech world is something that we haven't really dug too deep into. So I'm excited for founders at home that are building in the deep tech space to listen to this show, learn more about you, what you're looking for, and how you see the culture of deep tech shifting. There's a lot that's been happening over the past couple years. And so anyway, we're so thankful to have you today on the show.
Well, looking forward to it.
Now, I always start Demo Day the exact same way, and it really focuses on the why. I've seen from your background, you've been a CEO, you've been a founder, you've been an angel investor, you are someone that is on panels and just in the world of startups. You could really be doing anything with your time. Why have you chosen to invest in founders and to back startups?
I think it probably goes back to my early days of VC when I was at a corporate venture arm of a utility investing in energy tech. And I think a lot of VCs at the time wanted to invest in batteries and solar panels and things like that. But very quickly, when I started to do some of my due diligence, it became clear the Chinese government was subsidizing their solar panel manufacturers pretty heavily and would price under the competition in the US and take them out. I kind of raised my hand because I thought this was going to play out poorly in the long term, because they're essentially just taking an industry from the US that we basically got off the ground. And that worried me because I thought if we were giving up our techno advantage or techno dominance, that near peer competitors, countries like China, could catch up and eventually beat us in different ways. And I think what we're seeing today in terms of like defense investment is in some ways paying for our sins back in like 2008.
When it comes to startups, the world, at least for me, I'll speak on my own behalf, like when you have an e-commerce company that has a physical product you could hold, or when you have a software that it's like, oh, I could imagine what, this software could do for an HR. It's very tangible. It's very like easy for me to wrap my head around. Whereas when it comes to like energy and solar and battery, like it feels to me like it's almost in this like world outside of the normal day-to-day startups. And so I'm just curious, like, how did you get interested in that? Maybe you could bring us back into like early life. Where did you grow up, and where did you start to discover an interest in sort of the macro world of investing?
Yeah, so I think it started with an interest in technology at a young age. I should probably credit my brother and an elementary school classmate for sort of getting me initially interested in technology. I came home one day, my brother was building a computer in his room.
Wow.
And he's a younger brother by a few years. So, I mean, it seemed especially crazy to me. I was just like, where did you learn how to do this? And he just taught himself. He found some books and taught himself. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world, that my brother, with no help from anybody, all on his own, just decided he was going to go do that. And so, started helping him build these computers and sell them to our friends. And then, I had a friend that was more on the software side of things and started teaching me about coding and, building your own operating systems and things like that. So I think that was sort of the initial interest.
And was this in San Diego or in California?
Yes. Yeah. Grew up in San Diego. Pretty average childhood, honestly. Nothing too special about it. Spent a lot of time surfing, played a lot of sports, but, technology was kind of what really turned me on at the end of the day. So, later that expanded into other areas of interest.
And when you were going into college, like, what was sort of your mentality at the time? I know that, for many of our guests, especially those that have been in the industry for quite some time, startups weren't always like the hot topic. It wasn't always like the sexiest or the most fun thing to do. And so, did you take some of that from your parents? Did you get inspired by your younger brother? Like, what kind of pushed you into the world of startups and technology from like a business perspective?
Yeah, it was sort of by accident. It was kind of ironic actually because I went to Wharton undergraduate program, and I was kind of an idiot because I left one of my electives till my senior year. And when I went to go sign up for the elective, there's only two classes left, and one of them was called Venture Initiation, and the whole class was to pretend you're a founder, come up with a business plan, and your final grade was as a group to present or to pitch this business to a panel of VCs. It didn't go great.
Do you remember what the business was that you guys pitched?
Well, so I unfortunately got stuck with the football players for the group project.
They had you do everything.
Basically, I mean, story of my life. And like they wanted to pitch, it was like a vegan holistic club thing. I don't really remember that well. It was a terrible idea.
Okay.
So professor's like, I can tell you're the one that did the work. Like, so that you can pass, I'll let you redo the project, but you have to do it during senior week before like actual graduation. So while everybody else was out having a great time, partying with friends, celebrating graduation, I was stuck in the Wharton building working on this project. And I remember like out loud, just like cursing the high heavens that like I'll never have anything to do with startups or business plans or any of that for the rest of my life. And just a couple of years later, that's what I was off doing.
Wow. And now, when you were in school, was there, a mentor? Was there someone that helped guide you into the world of VC? Because at a pretty, early part of your career, you were already in the space of investment and capital. And like, what was the sort of transition from, I'm interested in computers, I'm doing this kind of cool, tech class for investing at Wharton, and now like this is something I want to start to do as a career?
Yeah. So I think it planted a seed. I wasn't really aware of it yet, but like a lot of my classmates, I went into investment banking after I graduated. And I mean, within a couple months, I figured out that it wasn't the profession for me. And there was a little bit of early stage work that they were doing and that I was helping out with. And I immediately started gravitating in that direction. And I think it was mainly because, if you're doing leveraged buyouts, these are mature businesses that are kind of determined to some degree. I thought the earlier stage startups were more interesting because it wasn't really determined. You kind of had to problem solve to get it there. And that was way more fun to me than crunching numbers on a spreadsheet and skimming some margin off of a deal, which isn't value creation in my mind. That's like sort of extraction. I was more interested in value creation. So like, how can we actually create a better future for ourselves?
And how did that manifest itself in your early career? Meaning, was there a moment you were sitting at your desk that you said, like, this isn't for me, I want to go find something else, and you started that journey? And if so, like, what worked for you and what didn't work for you? I think there's a lot of, people that are leaving school right now that are trying to figure out, man, I keep hearing about all these hot startups. There's investing, there's private equity, there's just a lot of ways to go. Maybe you could talk to us about like what where your headspace was at the time and how you navigated moving from that kind of identity to a new opportunity.
Time frame's important. This was sort of mid to late 2008 as the market's collapsing. So I kind of knew my job wasn't going to be around in banking much longer because those jobs were just disappearing left and right. So I started to try and figure out what it really was that I wanted to do next. And so there were a couple sort of major themes for me at the time. Value creation was one of them. I wanted to help create value. I wasn't technical or operational at that point, so I probably wasn't going to be very useful in contributing in those aspects. And so that's when I started to look at the financial side of things a little bit more, which I was more familiar with at that point. And VC was really a cottage industry at that time. So I thought it was interesting because, I had a lot of latitude to work in that space. And I just needed to sort of get smart in an area. I grew up a little bit of a hippie, surfing every morning in San Diego. So environment and conservation were kind of instilled in me. I had put up my own solar panels, built my own battery bank as an amateur. And that's what kind of pushed me in the direction of like climate tech at that point in time. And because there was a lot of federal funding going towards it from the Reinvestment Act, I knew that that was probably a good area to sort of start the VC career in, because it was the new hot area that had a lot of capital in it. So we could actually progress companies. And yeah, so I decided climate tech was what I wanted to go do. Didn't think anybody in Silicon Valley had a clue what they're talking about at that time. I mean, these were people that were predominantly SaaS investors. Those playbooks don't really translate over to, power and energy and that kind of technology. So I had a friend that used to run the fuel cell program at United Technologies. He and I somehow convinced a utility in Detroit to let us reboot their corporate venture arm. And so, yeah, November of 2008, I was one of the few people moving to Detroit.
And, from a perspective of like an early venture capitalist, now all of a sudden you've got like a new role, you have a new focus, you're in a new location. What's some of the kind of early days tips and tricks you learned to start to kind of like build your portfolio, did you have to find LPs at the time? And, what was kind of like day to day for you, like, early on as a VC?
Yeah, it was a corporate venture arm, so we're lucky. We only had one LP. That was the parent corporation. So we didn't have to do any fundraising, which is pure brain damage. The early days was sort of interesting. I mean, kind of got thrown right into the deep end because the federal funding had arrived. So the whole market was moving pretty quickly to deploy capital. And it was really interesting actually, because I remember the first company I looked at was a company called Cylindra that had these like photovoltaic tubes while everyone else was making these panels. And, I'm coming into it pretty green, honestly. But I think that was also an advantage because I wasn't sort of encumbered by, what everyone else already thought. So I remember showing up and very quickly within a few minutes figuring out that their solar tubes were already, some multiple of the cost of the solar panels that you can get from China. And they were already out competed, but the government was trying to throw billions of dollars at them in loan guarantees. And so it was a trial by fire because everyone around me was saying, no, we got to invest in solar panels. But I'm sitting here saying, I don't think this makes any sense. This is going to end poorly. And I'm thankful for that experience, even though it took me years to realize I wasn't wrong. And it's not about being right. But you kind of have to have some backbone in that industry because everyone's got an opinion and, very few of them are accurate. And you kind of got to do your own homework, listen to yourself, let the data present itself and make as an informed decision as you possibly can. And that's hard when you're 24 in a room full of, like, I got cursed out of an office by Vinod Khosla one day, because he didn't like my perspective on one of his portfolio companies. And, I think for like a couple of years, I was like, I just must be an idiot. Like, I must not know anything about this, when I just realized like a lot of people play a confidence game.
Now, now that you've had, a decade plus of perspective, what is something that you feel you've noticed about yourself that, maybe like something that you see in the industry that others maybe don't see? And maybe you could describe it more as like, what do you feel like is your superpower in investing and in finding the right sort of companies to build the future?
I think it goes back to the housing market crash again, when I think one of the big lessons I took away from that was like, read the fine print. And I carried that with me my whole life, because even in VC, I don't think a lot of people tend to, quote unquote, read the fine print. And that's where I decided to set myself apart, because I'm going to read the fine print. I'm going to understand it, and I'm going to compound that learning over time. And that's going to be my edge. I want to be a better picker of companies. I don't want to rely on the power law to produce my returns. I want skill and repeatability. So I think, having the pain tolerance to start over and over and over again as a beginner in multiple fields was really my superpower at the end of the day, where I don't think most people are willing to do that. They'll just hire somebody with a PhD to give them an answer. I wasn't satisfied with that.
What is something that you used to believe for a long time as an investor, but through the years you've realized is not true, or it's not like the way that you thought it was going to be?
I think I was pretty naive early on in believing that, there was some efficiency to the market, that the best technology would win, the best teams would win. And I think what I've learned, and, probably Peter Thiel's put, pen to paper on pretty well, is the fact that there's lots of different ways to win. And there's lots of different valid strategies. And it's not always the best technology that wins. It's not always the best team that wins. Sometimes it's just market timing, with a mediocre product that wins. So I think sort of expanding your understanding to the multiple different possibilities is really important to grow as a VC, because you have to learn these different strategies. You can't count on one of them because conditions are changing all the time.
Now, between 2008 and like 2017 or so, you really were, on the capital side of things. You had some of those experiences, and then you shifted into a founder CEO role. Can you talk a little bit about like where were you at that point in your life, and what made you want to kind of see what it was like on the other side of the table?
Yeah, I think probably, I imagine a lot of other VCs get a little bit of imposter syndrome, because you can't know everything, right? You can do your best to get smart, but I think what happened was I was experiencing imposter syndrome. I loved VC, but I felt like a fraud giving founders advice that, I hadn't even really learned myself. So, I decided that I wanted to come back to VC on the next cycle, but I'm going to spend the next 10 or so years gaining technical and operational depth. So that means going to work at different startups. So I wasn't done with energy at that point in time. I decided I was going to try and figure out where the next big solar market was going to emerge. So I was a little bit more downstream from the technology. It was more project development stuff. Did my research. I believed, for a lot of reasons, Brazil was the next big, or was a market that was primed and ready for solar, because they've got all these weird issues with their grid. And I just decided that's what I was going to try and go do. I went down to Brazil, ended up befriending an executive, or a founding executive of the largest iron ore mining company down there, who also happened to be on the board of the Ministry of Energy and Mining, and helped them put together a bidding system to kickstart the solar market in Brazil.
Wow, what was that experience like for you? I mean, because it sounds like at different points you've never been afraid to pick up, move your life, kind of figure it out on the ground, double click into the fine print. What was that like, moving to a new country and trying to start something up, not in your home base?
It was a lot harder than I ever imagined it could be, because like, I think people are just skeptical of the gringo that shows up in Brazil and it's like, I want to do solar. And they're like, who the hell are you? I think it was a lot of educating and winning trust, was sort of like the initial phase of things. And it was a little bit crazy. I had to learn a new language, a new culture. It's definitely not as safe down there. So, just kind of had to move and behave a different way than you normally would.
And did you have a, quote unquote, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to sell the company? Or did it feel like it was something that was a, exit opportunity from the beginning? Or was it something that you felt so passionate about, just like it was just for the love of the sport and to try to like really build something?
I think there's times when I'll sort of do this thesis development and then try and go put it to practice in the field. I will often run into these technologies and its development that just seems inevitable to me, where there's no way around it. Like, this is just the obvious next step. And if I really, really believe that, then I kind of owe it to myself to figure out how to try and capitalize on that. And so it was more of an exercise of just following what my current interests were. There's not like a nice, neat bow I can tie around it.
And did it end? And because obviously you're not at that company right now, so there since has been time in between. Did it end the way you wanted it to? Did it tell us a little bit about how, like, what was the journey like? Because on one hand, for years you're able to give advice, you're able to give people thoughts. And then, like Mike Tyson says, everyone's got a plan till you get hit in the throat, right? Or hit in the face. And so, what was kind of like the finality of that chapter, and then how did that end up bringing you into investing in some like really impressive companies? I mean, Epsilon 3, there are several Castellian, like there's a lot of, I think, awesome teams that you've been involved with. And so what was sort of the transition from like moving to Brazil, starting a company, and then how did you get back into the VC game?
Yeah, so Brazil didn't end great, mainly because this is part of my naivete at the time, which was it's a very corrupt country, like very corrupt. So there was a lot of what Americans would consider illegal behavior in the bidding process. So it wasn't really an open bid. It was more there were people trying to bribe one another and things like that. So I couldn't legally participate in that market, or I could get in trouble over here. So I basically had to sort of bow out and come back to the States. And yeah, it was a tough pill to swallow, but I didn't get that far, honestly. So it didn't really bother me that much. So I ended up coming back working at a Peter Thiel-backed startup in building micro displays for AR/VR headsets, essentially. Um, what I guess your question was like, what really got me into investing in these types of companies ultimately?
Yeah, well, going from an investor to a CEO, moving to Brazil, having kind of like the world on your shoulders, trying to get through a corrupt market and start a business, to then come back to the United States and to, start this next chapter of like angel investing, getting back into the investment game. I was just curious, like what that felt like at the time, and then what your mindset was as far as being able to get back up. A lot of founders, when you have to close up shop, especially when you've moved and like you're so much of your time, energy, efforts like wrapped up in it, was curious just how you bounce back and what advice you have for other founders that are going through a struggle of closing down shop and getting back on the horse.
I think the ability to sort of not let it like keep
Bury
it
you.
together or let it
Hmm.
bury you, like that kind of resilience is really important. I didn't have that right away. It took a few failures before I really found that. So the first few I took not super hard, but yeah, it sucked. Like I was disappointed. I thought, oh, I'll never be able to work in energy again or something like that. It's not the case at all. So after a few failures, you kind of realize like failure's not that bad. It's actually just sort of new updated information, and now you know the better direction to go, and so you just keep pushing forward. Um, I think that was also really helpful in sort of honing my skills as a VC, because you kind of it's like having a bad boyfriend or girlfriend. Like afterwards, you kind of know what you don't like,
Hmm.
and once you've done that enough, you have an even better idea of what you don't like. Um, what got me back into the investment game was I think I was lucky in that I followed my interest, and it just so happened to, by chance, lead me into space and defense, which is where I got back into VC. And again, it was just sort of like following my interests, because I had a startup that didn't go anywhere. We're building a next generation AR/VR headset, but the computer vision we're using was pretty useful for things like tracking targets using drones. And so all of a sudden, I'm on the defense side. Didn't plan on being there, but I think it's also in line sort of with my concerns about the competitiveness of our country,
Yeah.
and making sure we're staying the most competitive.
Maybe you could articulate that a little more for people that are even, unfamiliar of like, why is it important to be investing in this sort of defense technology? I think for me, I was watching the Sean Ryan and is it Palmer Luckey? And that just like opened my eyes so much to how technology is playing a role in, in military and in war and defense. And it was like, I had no idea that some of this tech was being used. So what are you seeing from a macro perspective, and like, why is it even important for this conversation to be had around the importance of defense technology?
Yeah, well, I think for a long time we had been the dominant power in the world. I mean, we had Russia as a counterbalance, but they weren't nearly what the U.S. was. And then China came up the learning curve incredibly fast, blindingly fast. I mean, in some areas they're ahead of the United States where they were decades behind before. And the reason this is important is because the second you lose your techno advantage over another country is the second that your national security is in jeopardy. Because if China achieves AI or quantum supremacy before we do, there's a whole lot of things they can do to disrupt our country, whether it's through intelligence or war or other things like that. Um, they can cause a lot of chaos, and we don't want that. We want prosperous, safe, stable society in the United States. I think everybody wants that, and so to maintain our techno advantage means we can keep that. And I think a lot of people will say that it could throw democracy in question if we lose that as well, because if we got into war with somebody like China that could potentially beat us, then all of a sudden, we're living in a completely different world under a different regime that are probably not in line with American sensibilities.
It's like it's hard for me to grapple with these technologies competing without like thinking of like a humorous caricature of like a ChatGPT icon like battling it out, and like it's like text on the screen and they're just trying to like outword each other in the chat prompting, and like what are we not there yet? Meaning like is it, there's this feeling of like I can go into ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or any of them and I can ask it any question and it's already got the information. And so it's like how much more needs to happen before we're in this, code red. Are we not already there yet? And how does it progressively get more and more, if that makes any sense?
I mean, I guess I don't worry as much about people accessing information. I mean, I think everybody thought of the internet as one day becoming this utopian world where you can freely exchange information and teach yourself whatever you want. And now that dream has died and we're on to AI, and I don't think it'll be any different. I also don't think, I think people thought the internet would be sort of a free and open space. Obviously, that was gamed on us with
Mm-hmm.
advertising and whatnot. And I think we're probably pretty naive to think, that they won't do that with AI. Like that, I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe that they'll engineer the answers they need for you to see.
As if it's like the modern day news where like there's some level of filtering going into it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
When it comes to these sorts of the world of defense tech or deep tech, I know tonight you're going to be speaking on a panel at the SoCal Deep Tech Conference. And like, what are the things that get you excited? What are the technologies? You obviously have a lot of experience in energy and, ways of becoming more efficient. We're talking right now about potential defense tech. Like what are the types of startups that like, you get intro to and you're like, whoa, like that's freaking cool.
It's so wide ranging. There's missile companies like Castilian who are building hypersonics, which are very hard to defeat missiles because they can fly and fast and move around in ways that are hard to defeat. Um, I think that one's super interesting because that right now is kind of like the atomic bomb was back in World War II. That is the deterrent. Um, if you have a system that can't be defeated, then you are supreme by definition. So that one's super interesting from that aspect. There's other ones like you know uh, an area that's really interesting is called PNT, position, navigation, and timing. So it's all like GPS is PNT. So I think that whole area of technology is supremely interesting because GPS is old. I mean, how many times have we been driving down the freeway and missed an exit because it didn't reroute us fast enough or something like that? And what we saw with Ukraine is that it can be jammed and spoofed very easily as well, and that causes lots and lots of problems because a lot of things depend on GPS. There's a company called Zona Space Systems that I invested in, and they've got a Leo constellation that's providing encrypted, secured,
Is a
spoofed,
Leo
jam-proof.
constellation like a series of satellites that connect to each other?
Sorry, a Leo satellite constellation is a constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit, so closer to the Earth than the GPS satellites, which are in geosynchronous orbit, really far away.
Can you see the low orbit ones as if they're like a drone, or are they still far away that you can't actually see it with the naked eye from ground, from like Earth?
Oh, you can see Starlink satellites which are in low Earth orbit with the naked eye.
Interesting. And do they just look like a drone, or like would they just be mistaken for some sort of a drone type?
I mean, it looks more like a plane in the sky. It's just sort of slowly traversing, the sky.
Wow.
Um, growing up, I used to go to Mammoth and go hiking over the summers a lot. And at night, if you're paying close attention, you can actually see, even before Starlink, you could see other satellites crossing the night sky.
Wow. Wow, that's crazy. What has been one experience or sort of like one moment that you feel like was an inflection point in your growth as an investor? Did it come from a specific investment you made or didn't make? Did it come from an exit that you had or didn't have? Like, was there one moment that you felt was a turning point for you in your investing career?
Yeah, there was one that, I mean, I still think about regularly. I was interviewing with DFJ, the legendary, Draper Fisher Durst VC firm, for a lowly, analyst position, I think it was. And they had a case study interview, and they gave me a deck for a company, and they said, "We'll give you a half hour, read through it, develop your conclusions, and we want an investment recommendation from you on this company." And so the deck that they'd put down in front of me was Pandora, the internet radio company. If I don't even know, is it? I don't even know if it's still
Yeah,
around.
still
Oh,
around
is
for
it?
sure. Oh,
Okay.
definitely.
And so I'm a big music geek, and I had been trying to figure out what the evolution of that industry was going to look like. And I remembered, like, I had the idea in my head. It was just iTunes in the cloud. That's all it was. Like, and so when they gave me this case study, I was like, I'm smart. I'm going to forget this, and I'm going to tell them about this European company that just emerged that nobody's ever heard of, called Spotify. And they're going to think I'm a genius because it's iTunes in the cloud, and there's all these reasons why it's such a better approach than Pandora. So they came in, they asked me, for my conclusions, and like just sort of nonchalantly threw the deck to the side. And I was like, I'm going to tell you about Spotify. And they looked me like straight in the eye, and they're like, "That's not what we asked you to do." Like, thank you, but you're excused. And so, I left that thinking like, I blew it. I'm an idiot. Like, that was a dumb idea. Eventually what I realized was, if I really believed what I thought, I shouldn't even be wasting my time in that interview. I should have been figuring out how to write them a check somehow. Like, I was like, it was completely the wrong place and time to be. And so that bias for action that I didn't have in that moment, is something that I think about all the time. Like, when I'm talking to a founder, like Brian Hargis, from the CEO of Castilian, for example, the first time I talked to him, I knew within about an hour of talking to him that there was something special about him, his team, and his company. And I could take another few weeks to do due diligence if I wanted to, but my worry was that other people would catch on, and all of a sudden the opportunity would be gone. So, thankfully, I had that tough experience earlier on in my career, and I didn't waste a second. I told him, "I'm going to write you a check on the spot, and I'm going to help you raise this round and get this company off the ground." And it was one of the best investment decisions I've ever made in my life.
That's amazing. Now, there's something to be said about the true breakaway founders. They just have they have something about them. But, you have such access to so many great founders, and there are certain ones, like you just mentioned, that are just like, love at first sight, if you will. What's the matrix that you bring people through in your head? Is it, yeah, maybe you could just talk to us about, like, when you have, two great founders, but one of them is like, someone you can't do anything but invest in them. What is that X factor, and what can other founders learn from what a VC like you sees as like a true breakaway trait?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times these are traits that you can't really reproduce. It's sort of innate to the person. And I would also say it's different for different businesses, because, the quiet, humble CEO can work for some businesses, while, you got to be a hard nosed, ram it down your throat kind of person for a different kind of business. So I'm not sure there's like this perfectly consistent set of traits that I look for. It's got to fit the business. But I would say more often than not, I'm noticing that there's like two basic qualities, and I call it low ego and high intellectual horsepower. The low ego, I think what comes with that is built-in resilience. It's not about whiplash reactions to challenges. It's about making measured, iterative, smart decisions and sort of moving smoother to move faster than just sort of, raising another round and trying something else and completely pivoting, which I don't always think works. And then with the high intellectual horsepower, it they have the ability to go further and deeper into a subject and produce better insights. And so the combination of the low ego, which also comes with network, because I think it works better in a lot of ways. That combination seems to be fairly consistent across most of the founders I back.
When it comes to making angel investments, or even through a more traditional VC fund, you kind of learn things along the way of like, oh, this is something I like, has worked really well. This is something that hasn't. What are some of the common mistakes that you see angel investors make early on in their investing journey? Because I would imagine early on, you want to get in the game. You also don't want to waste your money. You don't want to lose your money. Like it feels very high pressure. And so what are some of like the mistakes that you see some early angels make that, I know you already mentioned the double click into the fine print. I think that's really great advice. Anything else that you've learned is something that's a common mistake that early investors make in their career?
I think a lot, and this isn't to jab at any angel investors, but I think a lot of angel investors are sort of pre-VC investors and they want to get into VC. And so they're doing everything they can to sort of insert themselves. And I think oftentimes that can be disruptive to a business. And you like VCs and angel investors really need to learn, like lead, follow, get out of the way. And so I always, try and help angels understand that constantly inserting yourself can actually slow things down for the founder, and it's not ultimately helpful, even though it might be for you. But we're like, the founder's success is our success, so we should want what the founder wants, not just what we want.
How do you balance that? I've talked about this before. I could imagine that it's really difficult for an investor, or especially an angel investor, if it's really like their own money or their own family fund that they're investing out of. But it's like, how do you not get involved, or is there a right way to do it? Because you obviously have all of this experience, you have a network, you've seen so many blind spots that maybe those founders can't see, and you have genuine advice that will probably make an impact. But at the same time, it's like a one of your children, like you don't want to just do it for them. So how do you balance that? And is there a proper cadence that you found that just works the best for you in how you communicate with your teams and give constructive feedback?
It's typically asynchronous, so it's some kind of group chat usually, and that seems to be easiest. In terms of like what we're doing, it's sort of wide ranging. It can be helping from product development, technology development, hiring, fundraising. I think the best investors probably listen to what the founders need and help them on that, if they agree. I think this is where being a former founder is kind of helpful, because you have an empathy for the challenges. So you're not just telling them what to do, you're helping explain to them, what their options are and walking them through that. And ultimately it's up to the team to make that decision. So it's not as if I'm going to force them to do anything. But just presenting that in sort of a simple, articulable way wins founders' trust pretty quickly.
What is something about deep tech that most founders, like getting into the world of startups, maybe are unaware of or don't know? Like I said before, I feel like the SaaS and e-commerce world has been like glorified as like these are the two options that you have for doing a startup. Whereas, deep tech, it just, again, it feels like it's, at least to someone like me that's been in the space for a decade, it still just feels like it's like on the outer, it's in the El Segundo. It's not in still, right? It's kind of on that outside. And so, What do you have to say about the industry? What's something that maybe like entrepreneurial type people that maybe aren't thinking about deep tech or energy tech or any of these types of pieces? Like, what would you say about just the larger industry at large?
We're seeing sort of a big shift in VC refocusing towards deep tech right now. And that's not something I really ever thought would happen anytime soon because, like it's like 80%, like 80, 90% of VC was like SaaS consumer or healthcare for the longest time. With hard tech, this like tiny little sliver,
Hmm.
it's gone from about 10 to 20% over the last few years of VC. Um, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that SaaS is ultra competitive now, especially with AI helping speed up a lot of those cycles. And in a lot of instances, you just don't even need VC anymore. So that end of the market is kind of diminishing,
Mm.
and so investors need to refocus into new markets to find returns. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing happen right now.
What do you think is required of the modern day deep tech VC to accelerate and become, a top tier? Because, you can imagine like it's sort of like yourself. You're sort of on the early adopter. You've been on that frontier kind of part of the ecosystem. But like all technology, the wave is coming and you can already see it happening. So what's required of a VC today to really like help their portfolio get to the next level?
There's lots of different ways VCs can help founders, but it really is only useful if it's like within their strengths. So unfortunately, I meet a lot of VCs that really don't have anything other than like marketing and investor intros they can make. Um, I would say that's a lot of VCs.
Hmm.
Um, what's more helpful are folks that have got the operational experience and can see sort of the gaps. I think one of the ones I consistently see across early stage deep tech companies are founders that believe they know how to hire well. Um, this is mostly true just for first time founders. I think you learn a lot in that process. So, and most deep tech founders are first time founders. So, um, I see things like, they'll hire a recruiter onto their team and think that's the silver bullet, magic solution that'll get all the top talent that they need. Never happens that way.
The founder's the one that's bringing in the right sort of people. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, they've got to do a lot of work to bring in the right people. Like the CEO and founders will have to do a lot of that work themselves. They can supplement that with a specialist, but not all recruiters are created equal. So, I think that's one area that I see a lot of early stage founders lose time and money on, and that should honestly be something that's part of the standard playbook for a lot of VCs. I would have thought by now.
Now, do you see like, I think it made headlines in the past couple of months, like, as Meta started investing more into their AI program, doing like signing bonuses of like $100 million offers or $1 billion offers, over X, Y, and Z period of time. And, with like, again, defense tech and like these have such big impacts. Like, do you see that AI's role in all of this technology is going to also create this tiny little company just created the equivalent of the atomic bomb, like it's like, are there going to be outlandish financial upside in this space and in industry? And what are you seeing as far as like AI finding its way into these deep tech, hard tech? Because I would imagine, if you're a robotics company, AI can help accelerate X, Y, and Z. If you're there's still so much application. How are you seeing AI kind of starting to blend in with what you're doing day to day?
So we've had AI and deep tech for a long time, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I think a lot of people probably remember all these computer vision companies that emerged at one point. A lot of that was AI, and that was more than a decade ago. So it's been around. I think what we're seeing now is just more of like automation of simple tasks. So, and we're starting to, I think we're still early days in terms of really integrating that into design. So, there's a lot around simulation that can be sped up using AI rather than having to actually run these big bulky simulations.
Yeah,
You can do
especially with missiles involved or like hardware and things like that.
absolutely designing things like semiconductors, materials, things like that. So I would say we're still pretty early days, actually. Um, where that will go, I don't think it's going to lead to like one guy figuring out how to like build an atomic bomb by himself.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, it just because today AI still provides something that looks like it's not the answer. It's something that just appears similar to what an answer would be.
When you think 10 years out from now, do you, in your quiet moments, find yourself being more pessimistic or optimistic?
Optimistic, absolutely. Actually, the CEO of Array Labs, he and I had a conversation. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, and at the end of this conversation, he asked me, "Do I think the world is better today than it was a few years ago?" And I had to sit there and think about it for a second, but then it was just like very blatantly obvious to me. Yes, absolutely. It's like fewer people are in poverty, health outcomes are better. A lot of the basic metrics we measure, human progress on have improved over time. So I do think we're doing better today than we were in the past.
Because again, I think there's like, we grew up in this sort of Terminator movie, like, it's like, the minority, like there are certain movies that kind of like stick with you through the 90s and the 2000s that like, these sorts of technologies are finding their way in. And, I was, curious, like, is the general, uh, like energy towards excitement and growth, and when you're at these sorts of panels, what's the general kind of feeling and vibe and excitement like?
I mean, I think it's very exciting, because there's a lot of smart people out there that I don't think care about building the next Angry Birds.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't turn them on. They would rather solve what they feel is like a real world problem. And so I think more often than not, that's what you're doing with deep tech.
Is there any quote in your life that really resonates with you that you try to live your life by?
Yeah, yeah, I got one. Andrew Weatherall, who's sort of one of the godfathers of acid house back in the late 80s, he used to have these tattoos on his forearms that said, "Fail we may, sail we must." And it comes from like an old fisherman saying, "Fail we may, same idea." But anyways, um, and it was sort of a mantra of his fans, but I loved it because the idea behind it was just pure grit. Like sometimes you're going to wake up in the morning and it's just going to be a shitty day, but you still need to get up, go out and get on that boat and, put food on the table. And I think that kind of mentality, really does sort of help you develop your own kind of resilience and be able to move through hard situations and move forward, quickly without falling to pieces. And that I value. So that's something I try and live by.
I love that. Now, your journey has led you, from, working as an associate to being a partner in your own company to being a CEO to, now being at Blacklake. Like, what was it about Blacklake that got you excited? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about, how the team works, what you look for in companies that you work with. And, for anyone that has never heard of Blacklake, maybe just talk a little bit about the team and what you guys are up to.
Yeah, it's a defense holding company based out of Austin, and um, what we're doing is we're going after what we call the long tail of defense. So we are working with earlier stage companies in sort of a cooperative fashion to go after revenue opportunities that the big players aren't paying attention to, and we think that is a significantly thick tail, so to speak.
And do the types of teams that you invest in, do they typically come to you at a certain stage? Are they very early, like pre-product at all? Do they typically have some sort of revenue, or like what's kind of like the makeup of a perfect type of like partnership for you to have with a startup?
Yeah, we've found that companies that have raised at least $1 million so far have some traction within the Sabre pipeline, or that's sort of the starting point for us.
Sibber pipeline?
Small Business Innovative Research Grants.
Got it.
These are it's a phased grant system that various departments of defense and various agencies in the U.S. government will give out for early stage technology development, essentially.
And then as far as check size, do you guys have a typical kind of like, you like to live in, a certain, dollar amount, or how do you think about like the size of the checks that you invest in teams?
It really depends on the situation because it can vary by stage. So check sizes will range based on stage. It'll also range based on how well we think we can help progress that company. If we think we can significantly change the outcome for them to the better, then we'll probably invest more.
Jeff, this has been a really awesome opportunity to get to know you more and to just learn about the space. And, I really appreciate you so much. Last question that I have for you is, if there was one book in your whole life that has made a large impact, is there any book that you've had that you just recommend the world to go check out?
The one that probably opened my eyes the most was Gödel Escher Bach. I think it's almost like it's got so many different lessons in there, and it's not really about science and technology. It's more about how to think and ways to do that so that you're not fooling yourself, essentially. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've ever learned, is like we're the easiest people to fool ourselves, and you have to really bend over backwards to try and disprove yourself, and so that you're honest with other people.
Awesome, dude. Well, Jeff, thank you again for joining us today. Where can people get in contact with you? Or if there is a founder in the El Segundo ecosystem, or in the LA or California, or from anywhere around the country, where's like the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, easiest way is LinkedIn or Twitter. You can find me
LinkedIn,
there.
Twitter. Okay, cool. Well, Jeff, again, thank you again for coming in to Demo Day. We appreciate you. And from everyone listening at home, I'm your host, Sean Goldfan from Coefficient Labs, and this is Demo Day. Peace, guys.